Let's hammer out exactly what's going on in day 2 of creation. Hi everyone, welcome to Language of Life for Little Learners. This is your favorite Bible nerd, R.A. Sweeney, here to talk to you a little bit more about some of the vocabulary we see in Genesis 1. So today I wanted to talk about day 2 because there's a really weird word in there in our culture that doesn't make any lick of sense, and it gets translated a whole lot of different ways depending on which translation you're looking at because it doesn't make any sense in English. And so I wanted to kind of dive into what we're dealing with here. So the word that I want to talk about is Rakia. And when I am writing out my own translations, at least for my own notes, I don't even translate this word because I don't think that there's a good way to describe it in English, at least succinctly. If I'm going to publish something, obviously I'll figure out how I want to describe it in that. But for my own notes, I just put Rakia because it's a weird deal that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And this is a word that we have to remember that the Bible was written in a specific context. So it wasn't designed to say, well, let me tell you exactly how everything actually is. It's let me communicate some truth to you in a way that you're going to understand. I think the best example of this would be in the parables of Jesus. He's like, at one point he even says, like, how could I describe this to you? Let's see. Well, I guess we could compare it to, and then he goes on and he tells a parable. Because the people, even at Jesus' time, were not able to understand the reality of what's going on. So he's like, well, let me give you something that kind of gets you in the ballpark of what we're talking about. And so he uses their language to describe what he's thinking about. And that's important as we dive into this, because there's a large group of people, a growing group of people, who think that this word is meant to literally describe actually what happened. And whether or not you believe that, like, I'm not going to argue whether or not there actually is a Rakia, or whether or not God was using language that the people of the time would have understood. I don't think it should be a barrier, is why I'm bringing this up, because some people say, yes, God was saying there for sure is a Rakia, and he meant exactly that this is what it is. And other people are going to say, I think he was just describing what people would have assumed would have been there, and he was saying he made it. So the people already believed there was one, and he was saying, well, yeah, I made that, and I put it up there just to meet the people where they are. And I don't think it really is worth fighting over, is why I'm bringing all this up. If you think that there actually is one, great. If you think that he was just using the language of the time, that's fine too. I'm not going to argue with either one, because that, to me, isn't the important part of what's going on. So what is a Rakia? So in ancient Middle Eastern thinking, the world was land, and it's an earth-centered understanding of the universe. So you've got like your land, and then everything else is just up above the land. And we see as day 2 progresses, it says the Rakia is supposed to separate the waters above and the waters below. So everything's water. We saw that in the first verses of the Bible. And so it's trying to like hold up the sky waters from the down below waters. It's kind of making this bubble over the waters so there's air in there. And so a lot of translations will translate the word Rakia as like an expanse or a space. And so it's actually describing like what's between my hands. The word Rakia is actually describing this upper hand. It's the thing holding up those waters. And it gets translated in, like I said, a lot of different ways, like a vault or a dome. It comes from the idea of like beating something or hammering something. And so you see it described with like a lot of like metal work type things where something is like beaten into like a really fine, thin layer of something. So like the censers that are used for burning incense, it's kind of like this thin, shallow bowl that you would put incense in, and it's hanging from chains and it's burning incense. Shields can be described in the same way. So usually when we see it, it's hammering metal out really thin into kind of this dome shape. So probably the best way to translate exactly what Rakia means, it's like the hammered out dome thing. which, again, doesn't make a lot of sense in English because in modern English context, like we're not expecting there's a hammered up dome thing outside. At least most people aren't. Some people are thinking that could be a literal description of what's up there. But most people don't think that there's a hammered out dome thing up there. But that's at least how the Bible describes it, is that everything's water. And so God hammers out something into this thin dome-shaped deal that's going to then hold up a bunch of the water so that there's space for the air. And that gets a little bit confusing too, because that, going back to my, ground and dome, the space in between my hands can be called the heavens, the dome can be called the heavens, and everything above it can be called the heavens. So that's a little bit complicated. But we would probably describe it as like the sky being in between and then space being outside. And there's different ways to understand all that. But it's that dome thing that's holding back the waters. It's this idea that there is a barrier, basically, that is holding back those upper waters so that there's room for air. And as we go on through the rest of the week, we see that he's separating it into there's waters down below where swimming creatures can be, and then he's going to make the dry land where the land animals can be, and then there's the air where we have the flying animals. And so he's kind of separating that out to where we have two of those things. He's making the waters for the swimming animals, and he's making this space in between the Rakia and the waters for the flying animals, but it's this barrier that's holding up the heavens, essentially, to make sure that they don't collapse in and flood the rest of creation. And we see that too, where it talks about like the windows of the heavens opening for like the flood and things like that. It's opening holes in the Rakia so that water can come through and either rain or produce the flood or whatever the case may be. All of those things. So that's kind of what we're dealing with the Rakia. And that's important because we actually see the Rakia play out a lot in the Bible in ways that we don't typically think of because it doesn't get described as the Rakia. But when you think about if you're outside and you look up, you see blue. The idea was that you are looking at this really hammered out, ultra thin, you can see clear through it sort of deal, and there's water above it. So what color is water? Blue. That's why it's blue up there, because you've got this thin layer that you can see through, and it's blue on the other side. So you've got this idea of this hard blue hammered out in this gentle dome, so it'd look pretty well flat, kind of like the surface of the earth looks flat, even though it's slightly domed. And so we see it in a lot of places. Ezekiel talks about it a lot, where it'll talk about like a crystal pavement or something like that, when he sees God riding out of Jerusalem on top of the cherubim, he's sitting on this like crystal or glass surface in Revelation. The throne is upon a crystal or glass pavement. In a lot of different places, we see this clear or blue crystal glass, something like that, hard, flat surface. And it's meant to be that dome. It's seeing God on top of the Rakia is kind of what we're seeing there. And so, like I said, it's a really complicated idea because it doesn't really translate well into our context. But once you start kind of looking at how would they view things, how did it get used, we see this idea of it's a barrier to hold back the waters above to make space for dry land and air down below. God's up on top of it. That's why we see him on top of these blue surfaces in a lot of different stories. And kind of how it plays out in a lot of those different ways. So that is the word Rakia. I'll have you say it with me. The word is Rakia. I don't really have a great way to say Rakia means whatever like I normally do, because what word are we going to say? But I guess Rakia means the barrier that holds back the heavens from the earth to make space for life, which is a mouthful. But that's the Rakia. You can say it with me, Rakia. And again, it's the barrier between the heavens and the land, I guess would be a good way to describe exactly what it is. If you're enjoying these, please like, share, subscribe so that other people can follow along with us as we're journeying through Hebrew and Greek vocabulary. But for now, that's all I have for this week. Thank you so much for being a part of it with me, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.